I walked out of the courthouse with my son in my arms, and a silence so heavy it felt like it had weight. 5 minutes earlier, I had signed the papers that ended 12 years of marriage. No tears, no shouting, no last-minute hesitation. Just my name on a line, his name beside it, and the quiet sound of something final. My phone started vibrating before I even reached the bottom of the steps. Matthew. Again. And again. I didn't answer. I didn't even look at the screen long enough to feel anything. I already knew where he was. At that exact moment, while I was strapping my son into the back seat of my car, Matthew and his entire family were sitting in a private clinic across town. 6 of them. All dressed like this was something important. Something worth showing up for. They were waiting for the ultrasound. Waiting to hear about the baby he chose over me. They thought this was the beginning of his new life. The moment everything would finally make sense, fall into place, prove that what he did was worth it. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had already seen the numbers. I had already checked the dates. And I knew something about that pregnancy that was about to change everything. I closed the car door gently, like I was trying not to wake something fragile, even though everything inside me already felt numb. My son reached for me from the back seat, his small fingers curling around my sleeve, and for a second, that was the only thing that grounded me. I smiled at him. Not because I felt okay, but because he needed me to be. The phone kept buzzing in my hand. I flipped it face down on the passenger seat and started the engine. I didn't need to hear what Matthew had to say. I had already heard everything that mattered. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. She didn't look broken. She didn't even look angry. She just looked done. That was the part no one ever prepares you for. Not the betrayal. Not the lies. But the moment when something inside you goes quiet, and you realize you're not going to fight for something that's already gone. Matthew thought I would cry. He thought I would beg. That I would argue, demand explanations, ask him how he could do this to me. He didn't understand that by the time we sat across from each other in that courtroom, I had already moved past all of that. Because it didn't start there. It didn't start with the papers. It didn't even start with Lauren. It started long before that, in the small moments I ignored. The things I told myself didn't matter. The changes I explained away because it was easier than asking the wrong question. I drove without turning on the radio. The silence felt cleaner that way, less crowded. My son had already leaned his head against the car seat, half asleep, unaware that anything had changed. I envied that. Across town, I could picture it clearly. The waiting room. The way Matthew's mother would be sitting upright, hands folded in her lap, pretending to be calm. His sister checking her phone every few minutes. Someone making a quiet joke to break the tension. Lauren sitting there, trying to look composed. Matthew trying to look like everything was under control. They were all waiting for confirmation. For something that would justify everything they had done. But I had already seen enough to know that nothing about this was going to go the way they expected. I had seen the transactions, the appointments, the gaps in the timeline that didn't make sense unless you looked at them closely, closer than anyone thought I would. That was the thing about being underestimated. People assume you're not paying attention. They assume you won't look too hard. They assume you'll trust them. And for a long time, I did. Until I didn't. I stopped at a red light and glanced at my phone again. Missed calls, messages stacking up. I didn't open any of them. Whatever he wanted to say now, it was already too late. The light turned green, and I kept driving. I didn't know exactly what my life was going to look like after this. I didn't have everything figured out, but for the first time in a long time, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't walking away with nothing. I was walking away with the truth, and that was more powerful than anything they thought they had. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and exhaled slowly. It didn't start today, and it didn't end there either. But that was the moment I finally understood what had been happening all along. and why I was the only one who was going to come out of it with control. It didn't start at the courthouse. It didn't even start with Lauren. It started in the quiet spaces of a life that looked perfectly fine from the outside. I was a third-grade teacher in a public school just outside Chicago, the kind of job that didn't make headlines but shaped lives in small, steady ways. My mornings were predictable. Coffee before sunrise, packing lunches, reviewing lesson plans while my son finished his cereal at the kitchen counter. It wasn't exciting, but it was stable. And for a long time, I believed stability meant safety. Matthew was the opposite of me in ways that made sense back then. He was an architect, confident, composed, always thinking a few steps ahead. People respected him. His clients trusted him. His family admired him in a way that felt almost unquestioned. Together, we looked like we had it figured out. A house in a quiet neighborhood, a routine that didn't change much, a child who brought structure and meaning to everything we did. It was the kind of life people pointed at and said, "That's what I want." And for a while, I thought I had it too. Matthew's family was always part of that picture, even when I didn't fully understand how much influence they had. There were 6 of them who mattered, the ones who showed up to every holiday, every dinner, every decision that somehow became a group discussion. They were polite to me, respectful even, but not warm. Not the kind of family that embraced you fully. More like they tolerated you as long as you fit into the role they had already imagined. I didn't realize at the time how much that mattered. Looking back, I can see it in the way decisions were made. Financial conversations that happened without me. Subtle expectations about how things should be handled. Matthew never said it outright, but his family's approval carried weight in our marriage. And I learned to adjust. Not because I was weak, but because it felt easier than pushing back against something I couldn't fully define. My son changed everything in ways I didn't expect. Not just emotionally, but in how I saw the world. Every choice became about stability, about creating a space where he would feel safe, protected, and secure. That meant compromise. It meant letting things go. At least, that's what I told myself. Matthew started working longer hours sometime after our son was born. At first, it made sense. Bigger projects, more responsibility, more pressure. I didn't question it because it fit the narrative of a man building something for his family. He would come home later, sometimes distracted, sometimes tired, but still present enough that I didn't see it as a problem. Not yet. Our conversations changed slowly. Not in a way you could point to immediately, but in the way they shortened, became more functional. Less about connection, more about logistics. What time is pickup tomorrow? Did you pay that bill? Can you handle dinner tonight? Nothing was wrong, but nothing felt right either. I remember standing in the kitchen one evening, watching him scroll through his phone while I was talking about something that had happened at school. He nodded at the right moments, said, "Yeah," when it sounded appropriate, but I could tell he wasn't really there. I told myself he was just tired. That was easier than asking why. Lauren entered our lives through something that should have been routine. A recommendation. A name Matthew mentioned casually, like it wasn't important. "She's really good," he said. "A lot of people go to her." She was a doctor, smart, composed, the kind of person who made you feel like you were in capable hands within the first 5 minutes of meeting her. The first time I sat across from her, she smiled in a way that felt familiar, not inappropriate, not obvious. Just slightly more personal than expected. At the time, I thought I was imagining it. She asked questions the way good doctors do, thorough, attentive, focused. But there were moments where it felt like she was studying more than just my answers. Like she was trying to understand something beyond the surface. I dismissed it. Matthew seemed comfortable around her. Comfortable in a way I didn't question. Because why would I? She was a professional, someone we were supposed to trust. Appointments became more frequent. That part made sense. Pregnancy, follow-ups, monitoring. There were always reasons. Lauren started calling occasionally, checking in, following up on things that could have waited until the next visit. It felt attentive, even reassuring. Matthew encouraged it. "She's just being thorough," he said. And I believed him. There were small moments, though, things that didn't quite fit. The way she remembered details I didn't recall sharing. The way Matthew would answer questions directed at me before I had a chance to speak. The way their conversations sometimes drifted into a rhythm that felt established. Like they had spoken more than I knew. I noticed it, but I didn't hold on to it. Because holding on to it would mean questioning something I wasn't ready to question. The first time I saw something that didn't make sense, it was small enough to ignore, a number on a statement, a date that didn't line up with my schedule. I looked at it, paused for a second, then moved on. It wasn't enough to mean anything. Not yet. I told myself I was overthinking. That everything had a reasonable explanation if I just didn't jump to conclusions. And maybe that's what delayed everything. Not the lies. Not the betrayal. But my willingness to believe that none of it could be happening. I went back to my routine. Back to the life that felt stable, predictable, safe. But something had already shifted. Quietly, carefully, and right in front of me. Zem Taimthu gone. That feeling didn't go away. It got sharper. At first, I tried to treat it like a passing thought, the kind that disappears if you don't give it attention, but it didn't fade. It stayed with me, lingering in the background of everything I did, turning small moments into something heavier. It wasn't one thing anymore, it was everything. Matthew started coming home later, and not just occasionally. It became a pattern. At first, he had reasons, deadlines, last-minute changes, client issues, all things that sounded reasonable enough if you didn't look too closely. But when I started asking questions, the answers became shorter, less specific. Just work. It ran late. You know how it is. I did know how it used to be. That's how I knew this was different. He stopped making eye contact the way he used to. Conversations didn't flow. They ended. He would sit at the table with me, physically present, but somewhere else entirely in his mind. I watched him one night as he scrolled through his phone, his expression shifting subtly with each message he read. I said his name once, then again. He didn't hear me until the third time. "Sorry," he said, setting the phone down. "What were you saying?" I didn't answer right away, because I had already forgotten what I was saying, and for the first time, I realized it didn't matter to him either. He was there, but he wasn't really with me anymore. The phone became something I couldn't ignore. It was always with him, always face down, always within reach. He started taking it with him into rooms he never used to bring it into. The bathroom, the laundry room, even stepping outside just to check something. One evening, it rang while he was in the kitchen. I was in the living room, close enough to hear it, close enough to see the screen light up from where I was sitting. I didn't move. I didn't pick it up, but I watched. The second he walked into the room and saw it ringing, he grabbed it immediately, too quickly, like he had been waiting for it. He glanced at the screen, then at me, and the call ended before I could register anything. "Wrong number," he said. I nodded. But something about the timing felt rehearsed. The call ended the second I entered the room. Lauren's presence started to feel different, too. She wasn't just someone we saw at appointments anymore. She became part of conversations that didn't include me. Matthew would mention things casually, things she had said or suggested, but I couldn't remember discussing them with her. "She said we should monitor that again next week," he told me one morning. "When did she say that?" I asked. "Last time we were there." I tried to replay the appointment in my mind, the questions, the answers, the routine of it, but I couldn't place that conversation. "She didn't say that to me," I said. He shrugged. "Maybe you missed it." Maybe I did. But the more it happened, the harder it became to believe that I was the one missing things. She knew things I hadn't told her. That was the part I couldn't explain. Appointments started taking longer. What used to be quick, routine checkups turned into extended visits with reasons that sounded technical enough to accept without questioning. "We just want to be thorough," Lauren would say, her tone calm, reassuring. Matthew started insisting on coming with me more often. At first, I appreciated it. It felt supportive. But then I started noticing how often he spoke for me, answered questions before I had a chance to respond, filled in details that I didn't think needed filling. At one appointment, I sat there while the two of them discussed something I didn't fully understand. Medical terms, timelines, follow-ups. I nodded along, but it felt like I had stepped into a conversation already in progress. I started to feel like I was interrupting something. That was the first time the thought crossed my mind clearly. It didn't stay long. I pushed it away, because the alternative didn't make sense. It couldn't. The first real crack came in the form of a piece of paper, an insurance statement. It arrived in the mail like any other document, unremarkable, routine. I almost set it aside without looking at it, but something made me open it. I scanned it quickly at first, just checking for anything obvious. Then I slowed down. There were charges listed for appointments I didn't remember attending. Dates that didn't match my schedule. I went back through my calendar. My messages. My memory. Nothing lined up. I stared at one date in particular. A day I knew exactly where I had been. A day I had spent at work, from morning until late afternoon. But according to that statement, I had been at a medical appointment. I stared at the date, and I knew I wasn't there. I sat at the kitchen table longer than I needed to, the paper still in my hands, trying to make sense of something that refused to make sense. Maybe it was a billing error. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation I just hadn't found yet. That's what I told myself. Because if I was wrong, I would be questioning everything for no reason. But if I was right, I didn't let that thought finish. Not yet. Instead, I started paying attention. Not casually. Not passively. Deliberately. I began noticing the way Matthew reacted when I mentioned Lauren's name. The slight pause before he responded. The way his tone shifted just enough to feel different. One evening, I brought her up casually during dinner. She mentioned something about scheduling another checkup, I said, watching him closely. He didn't hesitate. "Yeah, we should probably do that soon." Too fast. Too smooth. Like he had already prepared the answer. He answered too quickly, like he had rehearsed it. Family gatherings started to feel different too. Subtle, but enough to notice. Conversations would stop for a second when I entered a room. Not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to feel. Matthew's mother avoided certain topics. His sister changed the subject more often than usual. No one said anything. But no one acted the same either. It felt like I was the only one not in on the conversation. That was when everything started to come together. Not emotionally. Logically. The phone. The appointments. The insurance statement. The way Lauren seemed to know more than she should. The way Matthew responded to her name. Individually, they could all be explained. Together, they formed something else. A pattern. I didn't have proof yet. But I wasn't guessing anymore. Something was happening. And it involved both of them. At some point, doubt stops protecting you and starts warning you. I didn't wake up that morning planning to find anything. If anything, I was still trying to convince myself that there had to be a reasonable explanation for everything I'd been seeing. That if I just gave it time, things would settle back into place. But something in me had already shifted. I wasn't ignoring the signs anymore. I wasn't explaining them away. I was waiting. That afternoon, I left work earlier than usual. It wasn't planned. A meeting got canceled, and for a moment I considered staying anyway, finishing paperwork, keeping my routine intact. But something pushed me to leave. Not urgency, not panic. Just a quiet instinct I couldn't ignore. The drive home felt longer than usual. Not because of traffic, but because my mind kept circling the same thoughts, trying to make connections I wasn't ready to fully accept. When I pulled into the driveway, nothing looked different. Matthew's car was there. The house was still. Too still. I sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary, my hand resting on the steering wheel, listening. There was no music coming from inside. No television. No movement. It didn't feel empty. It felt interrupted. I opened the door quietly, stepping inside like I didn't want to disturb something I couldn't see yet. The air felt different, heavy, like it had been holding something in. I set my bag down without making a sound and glanced around. That was when I saw it. A glass on the kitchen counter that wasn't mine. It was a small thing, something anyone else might have overlooked. But I knew every detail of that space, every object, every routine. That glass didn't belong there. Next to it, a handbag. Not mine. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I already recognized it. Lauren's. My chest tightened, not from shock, but from something colder. Something more certain. That was the moment I stopped hoping I was wrong. I didn't call out. I didn't make a sound. Instead, I moved. Slowly, carefully, each step measured, deliberate. My breathing felt too loud in the silence, so I held it, letting the house guide me instead. That's when I heard it. Voices. Low, close. Coming from the hallway. I stopped moving instantly. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, freezing me in place as I focused on the sound. There was no mistaking it now. Lauren. Her voice was softer than usual, not the calm, professional tone she used in appointments. This was different. Personal. Familiar. I didn't step forward right away. I stayed where I was, just outside the line of sight, letting the words reach me instead. Fragments at first. A sentence cut short. A quiet laugh. Then Matthew's voice. Not the one he used with me. Not the distracted, distant version I had been getting for months. This one was lighter, intimate, effortless. That wasn't how he talked to me anymore. I felt something shift inside me then. Not break, not shatter. Settle, like a piece falling into place. I leaned slightly closer, just enough to hear clearly now. There was no confusion in what they were saying, no room for misinterpretation. They weren't hiding. They weren't being careful. They didn't think they needed to. That was the part that stayed with me. Not just what they were doing, but how normal it sounded to them. And then I heard it. One sentence. Simple, quiet, but impossible to ignore. It carried everything I needed to know. That was the moment it stopped being a suspicion. I didn't move. I didn't confront them. I didn't step into that hallway and demand answers or explanations or anything at all, because in that moment, I understood something clearly. If I walked in, I would lose control. Everything would turn into emotion, into reaction, into something messy and unpredictable. And I didn't want that. I didn't want chaos. I wanted clarity. I wanted time. I stepped back slowly, carefully retracing my steps, making sure not to disturb anything, not the glass, not the bag, not the silence they thought they owned. When I reached the door, I paused for just a second. Not because I was hesitating, because I was deciding. Then I opened it and left. I closed it behind me just as quietly as I had entered, as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't just watched my entire life rearrange itself without my permission. I got back into my car and sat there, hands resting in my lap, staring straight ahead. My heart wasn't racing. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even shaking. I felt calm, colder than I had ever felt before. Because now I knew. Not guessed. Not suspected. Knew. And knowing changed everything. From that moment on, this wasn't about what they were doing. It was about what I was going to do next. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't mention what I saw. I didn't ask questions I already had answers to. Because I already knew how this would end. I just needed to make sure I was the one writing it. The hardest part wasn't what I heard. It was pretending I hadn't. The next morning, everything looked the same. The kitchen, the table, the routine we had built over years. I made breakfast, packed my son's lunch, reminded him to grab his jacket. I moved through each step the way I always had. Steady, predictable, calm. Matthew walked into the room like nothing had changed. Like the night before hadn't happened. He poured himself coffee, checked his phone, asked something about my schedule in that same distant tone I had gotten used to. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed him. But now every word, every movement, every glance felt different. Because I knew what he was hiding. And more importantly, he didn't know that I knew. That was my advantage. I answered him the way I always did. No tension, no hesitation. I gave him nothing to question, nothing to react to. But something must have shifted anyway. Maybe it was the way I didn't try to fill the silence anymore. Maybe it was the way I stopped asking questions. Or maybe it was just instinct. Whatever it was, he noticed. That evening, after dinner, he stayed in the kitchen while I cleared the table. Usually, he would have disappeared into another room by then, phone in hand, already somewhere else. But this time, he lingered. Watching me. "You've been quiet," he said. I didn't look at him right away. I rinsed a plate, set it in the rack, dried my hands slowly. "I'm just tired," I said. It wasn't a lie, just not the truth he was looking for. He shifted his weight slightly, like he was deciding whether to say something more. "I think we should talk," he said finally. There it was. Not panic, not urgency. Control. He wanted to get ahead of something. I turned to face him then, keeping my expression neutral. "About what?" I asked. For a second, he hesitated. Not long enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it. That small pause before he stepped into the version of the truth he had already prepared. "I don't think things have been working for a while," he said. It sounded rehearsed, clean, detached. I said nothing. He continued. "I didn't plan for any of this," he added, like that made it easier to accept. There was a moment of silence between us, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like a space he expected me to fill, with questions, with emotion, with something he could respond to. I gave him nothing. He exhaled quietly, then said it. "I've been seeing someone." There was no hesitation this time, no attempt to soften it. Just a statement. I watched him carefully, not reacting, not interrupting. "And it's serious," he continued. "It's not just something random." Of course it wasn't. I already knew that. I still didn't speak. Something in his expression shifted then. Confusion, maybe, or discomfort. He wasn't getting the response he expected. "Her name is Lauren," he said. The name hung in the air between us, heavier than it should have been. I held his gaze. He kept going. She's pregnant." That was the moment everything became irreversible. Not because I didn't know, but because he said it out loud. He turned it into something real. Something he expected me to accept. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Then I nodded. "Okay," I said. Just one word. His eyebrows pulled together slightly, like he didn't understand what he was hearing. "Okay?" he repeated. I shrugged lightly. "You said you wanted to talk. You talked." That wasn't the reaction he had prepared for. "I thought you'd have more to say," he admitted. I almost smiled. "I don't think anything I say changes what you've already decided," I replied. He shifted again, more noticeably this time. "It's not like that," he said. "We've been drifting apart. You know that." There it was. The justification. The rewriting of history to make his choices feel reasonable. This didn't just happen overnight. No, it didn't. That was the only part he got right. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he added, "but it did. And now he was asking me to understand that. To accept it. To make it easier for him. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was explaining why I should agree. I studied him for a moment, taking in the way he stood there, waiting for something from me. Validation, maybe, or resistance he could push against. I gave him neither. "So what happens now?" I asked calmly. That question seemed to ground him again. give him something structured to respond to. "I think we should separate," he said. "Figure out the details. Do this the right way." "The right way." I nodded again. "Okay." His confusion deepened. "You're just agreeing?" he asked. "What would you prefer?" I said. "That I argue with you about something you've already done?" He didn't answer, because there was no good answer to that. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that confirmed what I had already started to piece together. "My family knows," he said almost casually. "They think it's better if we handle this quickly." Of course they did. That explained the looks, the silence, the way everything had shifted before I even knew why. It wasn't just him. It was all of them. I felt something settle inside me again, not anger, not even betrayal anymore. Clarity. "Then we'll handle it quickly," I said. His shoulders relaxed slightly, like he had just gotten what he wanted. But he didn't realize what I had just decided. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't something I was going to fight emotionally. I was done being his wife. From that moment on, I became something else entirely. He thought telling me the truth would end everything. He didn't understand it was just the first move in a game I had already started playing. Once the truth was spoken out loud, everything became simpler and more dangerous. I stopped asking myself why. I stopped trying to understand how it happened, or when it crossed the line, or what I could have done differently. Those questions didn't matter anymore. They didn't change anything. What mattered was what he had done, and what I could prove. That night, after Matthew went to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the house completely silent. The kind of silence that used to feel peaceful now felt like something else entirely, like the calm before something irreversible. I logged into our joint bank account. I had access to it the entire time. Nothing was hidden in the sense that I couldn't see it. But like everything else, I hadn't been looking closely enough. Until now. At first, it looked exactly the way it always had. Bills, groceries, mortgage payments, the normal rhythm of a shared life. Then I slowed down. I started going line by line. Dates. Amounts. Locations. At first, it was just a feeling. A pause here, a second look there. Something that didn't quite fit but wasn't obvious enough to call out. Then I saw it. A charge from a medical office. I didn't think much of it until I checked the date. I wasn't there that day. I clicked into the details, scanning the information more carefully. It wasn't submitted through insurance the way most of my appointments were. It was processed differently, quietly. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. That didn't make sense. So I kept going. Another charge. Different date. Same pattern. I opened a new tab and pulled up my insurance account, cross-checking the claims that had been submitted. The ones I recognized were there. The ones I didn't, weren't. Which meant they had been handled outside of the normal system. Which meant someone had made sure they wouldn't show up. He wasn't just lying to me. He was hiding it in plain sight. My chest tightened, but not in the way I expected. There was no panic, no overwhelming emotion. Just focus. I went back to the bank account and kept scrolling. The further back I went, the clearer it became. Small payments at first, easy to ignore if you weren't paying attention. Then larger ones. Hotel bookings. I clicked into one and checked the date. That was a night he told me he was working late. I opened another. A weekend trip. He had said it was a last-minute client meeting out of town. I sat there, staring at the screen, letting the pattern form in front of me. It wasn't random. It was structured. Every transaction fit somewhere. Every expense had a purpose. Every date lined up with a moment I had already accepted without question. He didn't just have an affair. He built a second life. And he funded it with ours. I grabbed a notebook from the counter and started writing things down. Dates. Amounts. Locations. At first it felt unnecessary. Like overkill. Then I realized I wasn't just looking at this anymore. I was mapping it. I started connecting everything. The medical charges that didn't go through insurance. The dates of the appointments I never attended. The hotel bookings. The travel expenses. The nights he came home late. The weekends he said he was unavailable. It all aligned. Too cleanly. Too consistently. This didn't start when he told me it did. It went back further. Much further. I flipped to a new page and started building a timeline. Not emotional. Not narrative. Just facts. And the more I wrote, the more something shifted inside me. It stopped feeling like chaos. It started looking like proof. I sat back again, staring at what I had written. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't something that got out of control. It was a system. Deliberate, maintained, repeated. And that changed everything. Because a mistake can be forgiven. A system can't. I went back to the insurance account and dug deeper. There were inconsistencies I hadn't noticed before. Codes that didn't match. Gaps in reporting. Charges that should have been submitted but weren't. I didn't understand all of it. But I understood enough to know something wasn't right. Not just morally. Possibly legally. I felt that realization settle in slowly. What he did wasn't just wrong. It might have consequences he hadn't considered. That was when the stakes shifted. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This was about leverage. I closed my laptop for a moment and pressed my hands against my eyes, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed a second to process what this meant. If I confronted him now, he would deny it. Or worse, he would fix it. Move money, change accounts, cover his tracks. And then I would have nothing. If I moved too soon, I would lose everything. So I didn't move. I opened the laptop again and started taking screenshots. Saving statements. Downloading records. Every document I could access. Quietly. Carefully. Without leaving a trace. I organized everything into folders, labeling them clearly, making sure I could find what I needed later. Not because I knew exactly what I was going to do yet, but because I knew I would need it. He thought I was still reacting. He thought I was processing what he told me, adjusting, accepting. He didn't realize I had already moved past that. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. I closed the laptop again, this time with a sense of control I hadn't felt in a long time. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just something I had to survive. It was something I could use. Once I understood what he had done, I knew I couldn't handle it alone. I didn't rush into it. That wasn't how this worked anymore. Every decision had to be measured, quiet, and deliberate. I couldn't afford mistakes. Not now. The next morning, I dropped my son off at school like everything was normal. I smiled at his teacher, reminded him to behave, and watched him walk inside without looking back. That part of my life, the part that mattered, had to stay untouched. Then I got in my car and drove somewhere I had never been before. A law office. It felt strange even saying that in my head. Like stepping into a version of my life I hadn't fully accepted yet. But by the time I parked outside the building, I knew there was no turning back. Inside, everything was quiet. Controlled. Nothing like the tension that had been building in my home. The receptionist greeted me with a calm professionalism that made it feel routine, like people did this every day. Maybe they did. When I sat down across from the lawyer, I didn't start with emotion. I didn't tell her how I felt or what I had been through. I showed her the evidence. Bank statements, transaction records, notes I had written out carefully over the past few nights, dates, amounts, patterns. She didn't interrupt me. She didn't react the way friends might have, with shock or sympathy. She just listened. And when I finished, she leaned back slightly and nodded once. "That's consistent," she said. I blinked. Consistent? "With what I've seen before," she clarified. "This isn't random." That should have surprised me. But it didn't. If anything, it confirmed what I already knew. "This isn't just an affair," she continued. This is financial behavior that could impact how assets are divided. Depending on how it's handled, it could work in your favor. I didn't say anything right away. Not because I didn't understand, but because I was realizing what this meant. For the first time, I wasn't at a disadvantage. She pointed to one of the statements I had printed. These transactions, if they came from a joint account, are relevant, especially if they were used to support a relationship outside the marriage. I nodded slowly. They were. She tapped the page again. Then this matters. The conversation shifted after that. It stopped being about what he did to me. It became about what I could prove. She outlined the risks clearly. If he realizes what you have, he may try to move assets, close accounts, change access. You need to assume he will act in his own interest. That part landed harder than anything else. Not because it surprised me, but because it made everything feel immediate. If I waited too long, I would lose everything he was already trying to hide. She didn't disagree. You need to move carefully, she said. But you also need to move quickly enough that you stay ahead of him. That balance was everything. Too fast, and I would expose what I knew. Too slow, and he would erase it. We started building a plan. Simple, controlled. Document everything. Don't confront him. Maintain normal behavior. Secure copies of anything important. Every step had to look like nothing. I left her office with a folder in my hands and something new in my chest. Not relief. Not even confidence. Clarity. When I got back home that afternoon, Matthew was already there. Sitting at the kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone the way he always did. He looked up when I walked in. "Hey," he said, like nothing had changed. "Hey." I set my bag down and moved through the kitchen like I always did. Opened the fridge, checked what we had for dinner, asked him a question about his day. Normal. That was the hardest part. Acting like I didn't know anything. Acting like I wasn't already building something he couldn't see. He thought I was still reacting. Still processing. Still figuring out how to deal with what he had told me. He didn't realize I had already moved past that. I started organizing everything that night. Not just collecting it, but structuring it. Bank records grouped by type. Medical charges separated by date. Travel expenses aligned with his work schedule. The more I organized it, the more it stopped feeling like chaos. And started looking like proof. There was a system to it. A pattern that repeated itself over and over again. And patterns are hard to deny. I checked emails next. Nothing obvious at first. But enough small details to confirm communication that went beyond what I had been told. Billing notifications. Appointment confirmations. Names that appeared more often than they should have. This wasn't just something they did. It was something they maintained. The next few days passed in a strange kind of balance. On the surface, everything looked the same. Matthew and I spoke. Ate dinner. Existed in the same space. But underneath, everything had shifted. He started bringing up the divorce more directly. "We should probably start figuring out the details," he said one evening. I nodded. "We will." He studied me for a second, like he was trying to read something in my face. "You seem calm," he said. "I am." That answer unsettled him more than anything else I could have said. He wanted a reaction. Something he could respond to. Something he could control. But I wasn't giving him that. He wanted this over quickly. That told me everything I needed to know. He had something to lose. And for the first time, so did I. But I wasn't going to lose it. I wasn't preparing to leave him anymore. I was preparing to expose everything he thought he could hide. I thought the hardest part would be him. I was wrong. The first message came from his mother. It wasn't aggressive. Not at first. Just a simple text that appeared on my screen while I was in the middle of grading papers at the kitchen table. "We should all sit down and talk." No explanation. No context. Just an assumption that I would agree. I stared at the message for a long moment before setting my phone down without responding. A few minutes later, another one came. This time from his sister. It's better if we handle this like adults. That word adult sat heavier than it should have. Like I had somehow been the one acting out of line. I didn't reply to that one either. By the time the third message came, I already knew what they were trying to do. Control the situation before I did. It wasn't a request, it was a setup. I agreed to meet them the next day. Not because I felt obligated, because I wanted to see it for myself. The house was exactly how I remembered it. Clean, structured, carefully maintained. Nothing ever out of place, not even the tension that now filled every room. All 6 of them were there. Matthew's parents, his sister, his brother, and 2 extended family members who always seemed to be involved in decisions that weren't theirs to make. They were already seated when I walked in. Waiting. The way they all looked at me at once made it clear this wasn't a conversation. It was an intervention. I took a seat across from them, keeping my posture straight, my expression neutral. No one smiled. No one asked how I was. His mother spoke first. "We're glad you came," she said, her tone controlled, almost rehearsed. I nodded slightly but said nothing. She continued. "We think it's important to handle this situation calmly." Calmly. Like that hadn't already been the only way I was handling it. Matthew sat to the side, not quite meeting my eyes. That told me everything I needed to know about his role in this. He wasn't leading this. They were. His father leaned forward slightly. "This isn't the kind of situation that needs to get complicated," he said. "There's a way to resolve this that works for everyone." Everyone. I almost asked what that meant. But I already knew. His sister spoke next. "Matthew didn't plan for things to happen this way," she said. "But what matters now is that we move forward in a way that's best for the future. The future. Not mine. Not the one I had built. The one they had already decided to replace. And Lauren," his mother added, choosing her words carefully. "She's a good woman. She's stable. She understands Matthew's world." There it was. Not even subtle. They weren't trying to fix anything. They were replacing me. "She's going to be part of this family," his brother said more directly. "And the baby, that changes things." I let the silence sit for a moment after that. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I wanted them to feel it. To hear what they had just admitted without me interrupting it. They had already accepted her. Already made space for her. I already decided I didn't belong in it anymore. "This doesn't have to be difficult," his mother continued. "If we handle the divorce quickly, we can avoid unnecessary stress, especially for your son." There it was again. The shift. From suggestion to pressure. From conversation to expectation. They weren't asking me. They were telling me what was going to happen. His father added, "Dragging this out won't help anyone. It's better to come to an agreement now." An agreement that benefited them. I could see it clearly now. The urgency. The need to close this before anything else came to light. This wasn't about keeping the peace. It was about protecting what they thought was theirs. I finally spoke. "You can speak to my lawyer," I said calmly. The room went still. Not because they didn't hear me. Because they didn't expect that answer. His sister frowned slightly. "There's no need to bring lawyers into this," she said. "We can handle this ourselves." I held her gaze. "No," I said, "we can't." That was the moment everything shifted. The control they thought they had started to slip. His mother's tone hardened just enough to notice. "We're trying to make this easier for you." I almost laughed. "For me?" I repeated quietly. No one answered. Because they couldn't. Matthew finally spoke then. "Jennifer, we don't need to make this complicated." I turned to look at him for the first time since I sat down. "I'm not the one complicating it," I said. That landed. I could see it in the way his expression changed. In the way the room seemed to tighten around him. For the first time, they didn't know what I was going to do. And that made them uncomfortable. Good. I stood up slowly, smoothing my hands over my coat. "This conversation is over," I said. His mother started to say something, but I didn't stay to hear it. I walked to the door without rushing, without hesitation, and stepped outside into the cold air. The door closed behind me with a quiet click. No raised voices. No dramatic exit. Just a line that had been drawn, clearly and permanently. I hadn't lost a husband. I had walked out of something much bigger. And for the first time, they realized I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. They tried to control the story outside, but the moment we walked into that room, everything changed. The mediation office didn't look dramatic. No raised benches, no echoing walls like a courtroom. Just a long table, neutral colors, quiet lighting, controlled, professional. But I could feel the tension the second I stepped inside. Matthew was already there, sitting with his lawyer. He looked composed, the same way he always did when he thought he had everything under control. Calm, posture, measured expression. Like this was just another negotiation he was prepared to win. He glanced at me briefly when I entered, then looked away, like eye contact might complicate something he had already decided. His lawyer gave a polite nod. Mine didn't. I took my seat without saying a word, placing my folder neatly on the table in front of me. I didn't open it. Not yet. Matthew's lawyer began speaking first, setting the tone. "We're here to reach a fair and efficient resolution," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "Both parties have expressed interest in avoiding unnecessary conflict." Of course we had. Conflict only worked if both sides didn't know what the other was holding. Matthew leaned forward slightly, as if to reinforce the idea. "I think we both want to handle this in a way that's respectful," he added. "There's no reason to drag things out." Respectful. I almost admired how easily he said that. He started outlining what he thought was reasonable. Division of assets. Shared responsibilities. A structure that sounded balanced if you didn't look too closely. But I didn't interrupt. I let him talk. Every word, every explanation, every carefully chosen phrase. Because the more he spoke, the more he revealed. The more he assumed I didn't know. When he finished, there was a brief silence. Then my lawyer leaned forward slightly. "Before we discuss terms," she said, "we'd like to address some financial matters." Matthew's expression didn't change immediately. But I saw it. That subtle tightening around his eyes. She slid the first document across the table. Bank statements. Not summaries. Details. Dates. Transactions. Patterns. "This account," she continued calmly, "has been used for a number of expenses that are not consistent with marital use." Matthew glanced down at the paper, then back up. "It's just normal spending," he said. My lawyer didn't respond right away. She simply placed another document beside the first. "Hotel charges," she said. Another. "Travel expenses." Another. "Medical payments processed outside of insurance claims." That was when the room shifted. The confidence didn't disappear all at once. It cracked. "This doesn't prove anything," Matthew said quickly, his tone changing just enough to notice. "It proves consistency," my lawyer replied. She turned one of the pages toward him, tapping lightly on a series of highlighted dates. "These transactions align with documented absences and separate financial activity over an extended period." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The structure spoke for itself. I watched him as he flipped through the pages, faster than he should have, like he was trying to find something that wasn't there. An explanation. A gap. Anything. But there wasn't one. "It wasn't intentional," he said, his voice tighter now. "Things just overlapped." That was when my lawyer shifted the conversation. "Intent is not the only factor here," she said. "Use of joint funds in this manner has implications for asset division." Implications. That word landed harder than anything else, because it meant consequences. Real ones. "This isn't just about personal behavior," she continued. "It's about financial conduct during the marriage." Matthew's lawyer leaned in then, his tone changing. "We can address these concerns without escalating things unnecessarily." Damage control. That's what it was. For the first time, they weren't leading the conversation. They were reacting to it. Matthew sat back in his chair, his composure slipping just enough to see. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said. "No," my lawyer replied calmly. "It's being documented." Silence followed. Not the kind that feels empty. The kind that forces you to sit in what's already been said. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely. He wasn't negotiating from a position of strength anymore. He was trying to contain something that had already been exposed. The discussion that followed moved differently. Slower. More careful. The terms he had outlined earlier started to change. Subtly at first. Then more clearly. Custody leaned in my favor. The house became less negotiable. Financial distribution shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to show where the leverage was. I didn't speak much. I didn't need to. Every point was made without me having to say it out loud. Every argument was built on what I had already uncovered. At one point, Matthew looked at me directly. Not with anger. Not even with frustration. With something closer to realization. Like he was finally understanding what had been happening in front of him. "You knew," he said quietly. I held his gaze for a second, then looked away. That was answer enough. There was no satisfaction in it. No sense of victory. Just clarity. This wasn't about making him lose. It was about making sure I didn't. By the time we stood up from the table, nothing was finalized. But everything had changed. The outcome had already shifted. He just hadn't fully accepted it yet. As we walked out, I felt something settle inside me. Not relief. Not closure. Something steadier. He thought this was the hardest part. But what happened next was something none of them saw coming. While everything was collapsing for him in one room, something else was about to fall apart in another. I didn't stay to see how the meeting ended. I didn't wait for final words or signatures or whatever form of closure he thought he still deserved. The moment I stepped out of that building, I knew I was done. Not just with the marriage, with everything connected to it. I walked to my car, my steps steady, my mind quiet in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. My phone buzzed once in my hand. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. I already knew what the next part of the day looked like. I opened the back door and leaned in to adjust my son's seatbelt, brushing a hand gently over his shoulder. He looked up at me, unaware, trusting, completely untouched by everything that had just unfolded. "Are we going home?" he asked. "Not today," I said softly. That was all he needed. I closed the door and walked around to the driver's seat, taking one last breath before getting in. Across town, in a private clinic, I had only been to a handful of times. 6 people were sitting together in a waiting room that felt more like a celebration than a medical appointment. Matthew was there. His mother, sitting upright with her hands folded neatly in her lap, already imagining the future she had decided was better. His sister scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up, impatient for something to confirm what she already believed. The others filling the space with quiet conversation that didn't quite hide the anticipation underneath. And Lauren, sitting at the center of it. They had built this moment in their minds, prepared for it, invested in it. The child she was carrying wasn't just a baby to them. It was proof, justification, a reason to believe that everything they had done had led to something right. Matthew sat beside her, composed again, or at least trying to be. The cracks from earlier were still there, hidden beneath a surface he was struggling to maintain. He needed this to go well. They all did. Because if it didn't, then everything they had chosen, everything they had defended, would start to fall apart. The room was quiet, but not tense yet. There was still expectation in the air, still confidence. They were waiting for confirmation. But I had already seen what they were about to hear. I started the car. The engine hummed softly, grounding me in something real, something separate from everything happening somewhere else. At the clinic, Lauren shifted slightly in her seat. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was the first sign that something wasn't aligned with the atmosphere around her. Her hands were tighter than they should have been. her posture just slightly off. Matthew noticed it but didn't question it. Not yet. He couldn't afford to. The nurse called her name. Lauren stood, smoothing her hands over her clothes in a gesture that looked practiced, controlled. Matthew stood with her. His mother followed, along with the others, moving as a unit. Together. They weren't waiting for news. They were waiting for confirmation. I pulled out of the parking lot and onto the main road, merging into traffic without thinking. The world outside moved the same way it always did. Cars passing, lights changing, people going about their lives like nothing had shifted. Inside that clinic, time slowed. Lauren lay back as the procedure began, the quiet hum of equipment filling the space. The doctor's voice was calm, professional, steady. Routine. At first, Matthew stood close, watching the screen, trying to read something he didn't understand. His family hovered just behind, leaning in slightly, as if proximity would give them clarity. The room felt full, until it didn't. Something changed. Not all at once, just enough. The doctor's tone shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough that the energy in the room followed it. The conversation slowed. Questions were asked more carefully. Answers came with more space between them. Matthew straightened slightly, his attention sharpening. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice controlled but tighter than before. The doctor didn't answer immediately. That was the moment everything started to unravel. Because silence in a room like that doesn't feel neutral. It feels like a warning. Lauren's expression changed first. Not dramatically. But the confidence she had been holding onto slipped just enough to reveal something underneath it. Uncertainty. The doctor spoke again, this time more deliberate. Clarifying. Explaining. Referencing details that didn't align as expected. Dates. Measurements. Information that should have matched perfectly, but didn't. Matthew frowned, trying to process it. "I don't understand," he said. And for the first time, that was true. The family shifted behind him. The anticipation that had filled the room moments ago was replaced with something else. Confusion. Then doubt. Lauren sat up slightly, her voice sharper now. "There has to be a mistake," she said quickly. But the doctor didn't match her urgency. The explanation continued. Careful. Measured. Unavoidable. The timeline didn't fit. Something wasn't aligning with what they believed. And that was all it took. The future they had been celebrating disappeared in seconds. I didn't need to be there to see it. I didn't need to hear the rest. Because I already knew how it would unfold. The questions. The looks. The shift in trust that can't be undone once it starts. I drove forward, my hands steady on the wheel, my eyes focused on the road ahead. Behind me, everything I had walked away from was finally starting to collapse under its own weight. By the time they started asking the right questions, it was already too late to fix what they thought they had built. What broke in that room didn't stay there. It followed him everywhere. By the time they left the clinic, nothing about them looked the same. The energy that had filled the room earlier, the certainty, the quiet celebration, the sense that everything was finally aligning was gone. In its place was something heavier, something uncertain. No one spoke at first. They walked out together, but not the way they had walked in. There was space between them now. Not physical distance, but something harder to define. A break in alignment. Matthew moved beside Lauren, his expression tight, controlled in a way that didn't quite hold. He tried to say something as they reached the parking lot, but she didn't respond immediately. She was looking straight ahead. Avoiding him. That was the first crack. His mother was the one who spoke first, her voice quieter than before. "What exactly did he mean?" she asked, not directly to anyone, but loud enough that it hung in the air. No one answered. Because there wasn't a clear answer anymore. Lauren turned then, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the strain underneath. "There's probably just an error," she said. "It happens." But her tone didn't match her words. It wasn't confident. It was defensive. Matthew stepped closer to her. "What kind of error?" he asked. The question was simple. but it carried everything. She hesitated, just for a second, and that was enough. Because hesitation, in a moment like that, feels louder than anything else. The others noticed it too. You could see it in the way they looked at her differently. Not openly suspicious yet. Not confrontational. But watching. For the first time, they weren't listening to her. They were evaluating her. The drive home was silent. No one tried to fill it. No one tried to smooth it over or explain it away. The version of reality they had all agreed on earlier no longer fit. And without that, there was nothing to hold on to. Back at the house, the tension only grew. Questions started quietly, almost carefully at first. What did he mean about the timeline? Is there something we're missing? Each one directed at Lauren, each one pulling at something she was trying to keep together. She answered, but her responses didn't settle anything. They only made it worse. Matthew stood off to the side, listening, trying to piece together something that made sense. But it didn't. Not anymore. For the first time, he wasn't in control of the situation. He wasn't leading the conversation. He was reacting to it. And he didn't know how. That was when everything started to fracture. His sister stepped back, crossing her arms, her expression shifting from certainty to skepticism. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "It doesn't match what we were told." His mother looked between them, her confidence shaken but not gone. "There has to be an explanation," she insisted. But even she didn't sound convinced. Lauren's voice rose slightly, just enough to break the controlled tone she had maintained before. "I've already told you everything," she said. But now, those words sounded different. Not reassuring. Defensive. Matthew finally spoke again, his voice sharper now. "Then explain it again," he said. That was the moment everything shifted completely. Because it wasn't a request. It was a demand. And it came with doubt. The kind of doubt that doesn't disappear once it's there. Their future, the one they had been so certain about, was no longer stable. It was being questioned from the inside, and there was no easy way to fix that. At the same time, miles away, my phone lit up with a message from my lawyer. I pulled over before opening it. Not because I was nervous, because I wanted to read it clearly. "Some of the accounts have been flagged," the message read. "There may be further review required." I stared at the screen for a moment, letting the words settle. Further review. That meant attention. That meant exposure. That meant everything he had tried to keep controlled was starting to move beyond him. I set the phone down slowly, exhaling as I looked out through the windshield. The system he thought he could hide in was starting to look back at him. Back at the house, things were unraveling faster. The family dynamic that had once felt unified was now turning inward. Conversations that had been confident hours earlier were now uncertain, fragmented. His brother spoke less. His sister watched more. His mother tried to hold on to control, but even that was slipping. Lauren stood in the middle of it, no longer the center of admiration. Now she was the center of doubt. And Matthew was trying to hold it together, trying to manage both sides of something that no longer aligned. He reached for his phone and scrolled, paused, then dialed. My name appeared on his screen. Once, twice, 3 times. I watched the calls come in, and I didn't answer. He was finally talking to me, but I had already stopped listening. The silence between us now wasn't confusion. It was distance. Permanent. I leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes for just a second. Not out of exhaustion. Out of clarity. I didn't need to hear what he had to say. I didn't need an explanation. I didn't need an apology. Because whatever he thought he could rebuild without me was already falling apart. He lost more than a marriage. He lost everything he thought he could control. When everything finally went quiet, I realized I wasn't broken. I was free. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single moment where everything felt better, where the weight disappeared and life suddenly made sense again. It was slower than that, quieter. The kind of change you only notice when you stop looking back. A few weeks after everything ended, I moved. Not far enough to erase the past completely, but far enough that it no longer followed me into every room. A smaller place, simpler, easier to manage. No echoes of old conversations, no reminders sitting in corners waiting to be noticed. Just space. Space to rebuild something that actually belonged to me. My mornings changed first. No more checking his schedule. No more adjusting mine around his. No more wondering where he was or what he was doing. It was just me and my son. Breakfast at the kitchen table. Quiet conversations before school. The kind of routine that felt steady, not forced. For the first time in a long time, nothing felt uncertain. I went back to teaching without the constant distraction in the back of my mind. I found myself more present, more focused, like a part of me that had been split was finally whole again. And at night, when the house was quiet, it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt calm. I thought about everything that had happened, but not the way I used to. Not searching for answers or trying to understand why. Just seeing it clearly. It wasn't one moment that ended my marriage. It wasn't the confession, or the clinic, or even the papers I signed that day. It was the pattern. The small things I ignored. The changes I explained away. The silence I accepted because it was easier than asking the wrong questions. I didn't lose everything that day. I just stopped pretending I hadn't already lost it. And once I saw that, everything else made sense. I didn't win because I fought harder. I didn't win because I exposed him. I won because I stopped reacting. Because I waited. Because I paid attention when it mattered. Power isn't loud. It doesn't show up in arguments or dramatic moments. Sometimes it's just knowing when to stay quiet. When to step back. When to let the truth unfold on its own. I heard updates about Matthew and Lauren through people who still talked more than they should have. Not details. Just enough. Things didn't hold together the way they expected. The tension from that day never really went away. Once doubt enters something like that, it doesn't leave. It changes everything. The family that once stood behind them stepped back. Not completely, but enough. Enough to show that their support had conditions. And once those conditions were questioned, everything shifted. I didn't feel anything when I heard it. No satisfaction. No relief. Just distance. They had everything they chose, and none of what they expected. I stopped checking my phone for messages that didn't matter. I stopped replaying conversations in my head. I stopped wondering what I could have done differently, because there was nothing left to fix. Some endings don't need closure. They just need space. One evening, I sat on the floor of our living room, helping my son put together a puzzle. He was focused, determined, completely absorbed in something simple. He looked up at me at one point and smiled. "Did I do it right?" he asked. I looked at the pieces, slightly misaligned but close enough. "You're figuring it out," I said. And I realized I was too. Not perfectly. Not all at once. But enough. That was all I needed. I didn't walk away with nothing. I walked away with clarity. With control. With a life that no longer depended on someone else's choices. And that was more than enough. If you've ever been in a situation where everything you trusted started to fall apart quietly, where the truth showed up before you were ready to see it, I wonder what you would have done. Would you have confronted it immediately? Or waited, like I did? Let me know in the comments. I read every story, and sometimes the strongest lessons come from what we choose not to say out loud. And if stories like this speak to you, if you've ever had to rebuild something from the ground up without anyone noticing until it was done, stay with me. There's always another story, and sometimes it might sound a little too familiar. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.